I always thought I was the kind of man who could handle the night. The quiet hours after midnight were my refuge, my time to unwind after a long day of work and a few too many drinks at the bar. But that night was different. It was past 1 in the morning when I turned onto that lonely stretch of road. The air was heavy with fog, so dense it seemed to swallow the world whole. My car's headlights barely pierced through it, casting an eerie glow over the asphalt. Even the usual nocturnal sounds, the chirping crickets, the distant rustle of trees, were absent. The road was empty, as it always was at that hour, and I felt an odd sense of detachment, like I was driving through a dream. Then, out of nowhere, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the road, her figure illuminated by the faint light of my car. A woman, tall and slender, dressed in a flowing white dress that seemed too pristine for such a desolate place. Her hair, long and dark, cascaded down her back, and her pale skin seemed almost to glow in the mist. I slowed the car instinctively, the alcohol in my system dulling the alarm bells that should have been ringing in my head. What was she doing out here, miles away from the nearest town? As I rolled to a stop, she turned to face me. Her eyes met mine, dark and unreadable, yet somehow magnetic. I couldn't look away. She didn't smile, but there was something oddly inviting about her expression. Against my better judgment, or perhaps because of the alcohol, I rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were floating rather than walking. When she was just a few feet away, she tilted her head slightly and said, in a voice as soft as a whisper, "Do you have a cigarette?" I didn't smoke, but for some reason, I felt compelled to keep talking to her. Something about her presence was both unsettling and mesmerizing. I fumbled with my words as I replied, I don't have any cigarettes. Sorry." She didn't respond right away, just stood there, her dark eyes boring into mine. The silence stretched on for a moment too long, and I could feel the air around us grow heavier, like the fog itself was closing in. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but with a strange undertone that made my skin crawl. "It's okay. You're kind to stop. Most wouldn't." I nodded, unsure what to say, and gestured toward the passenger seat. "Do you need a ride? It's late, and it's not safe out here alone." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the empty seat. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, but then she smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips, and opened the car door. As she slid into the seat beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her movements were graceful, but unnaturally deliberate, like she was mimicking how a person should act. The smell of the car changed, to an earthy, metallic scent that I couldn't place. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anywhere," she replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Just away from here." Her answer didn't make sense, but I didn't press her. Instead, I put the car in gear and started driving. The road stretched out endlessly before us, the fog swallowing everything outside the glow of the headlights. For a while, we sat in silence. She didn't fidget or look around, just sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her lap. I found myself glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of her presence. Her face was striking, almost too perfect, like a porcelain doll come to life. Her skin was pale but flawless, and her dark hair framed her face in soft waves. But it was her eyes that unsettled me the most. They seemed too dark, like there was nothing behind them but an endless void. I cleared my throat, desperate to break the silence. "So, what were you doing out here anyway?" She turned to me then, her expression unreadable. "Waiting? For what?" I asked, regretting the question as soon as it left my mouth. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "For someone like you." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was meant as a compliment or a warning. The tension in the car was suffocating. I kept my eyes glued to the road, but I couldn't ignore the presence of the woman beside me. Her words echoed in my head. "For someone like you," trying to shake off the unease. I forced myself to ask, "So, where are you from?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "Nowhere you'd know," she said with a faint smile, her voice soft but carrying an odd weight. The answer didn't help my nerves. I decided to focus on driving. The road was eerily quiet, with no other cars or signs of life. The fog seemed to grow thicker, swirling around the car like a living thing. Even the familiar hum of my engine seemed muted. She didn't move or speak for a while, but I could feel her gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. My palms were sweaty, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Finally, I broke the silence again. "Look, it's none of my business, but why were you out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere?" This time, her smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I was waiting for the right moment, and for you to come along." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Something about the way she spoke made my stomach churn. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she delivered them, like she knew something I didn't. I glanced at her briefly, and that's when I noticed her hands. They were resting in her lap, but they didn't look right. Her fingers were too long, the joints slightly off, as if they didn't belong to her body. I jerked my eyes back to the road, my heart pounding. "You okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her head slowly to face me. Why wouldn't I be? I forced a laugh, trying to mask my fear. "No reason. Just you seem a little tense." Her smile disappeared. "Do I make you nervous?" I shook my head quickly. "No, not at all. Just trying to make conversation." Her expression remained unreadable, but she didn't press further. I tried to focus on the road again, but the unease was growing stronger. The air in the car felt colder, and that metallic scent was becoming more pronounced. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke again. "Do you believe in fate?" The question caught me off guard. I guess. Maybe. Why?" She turned to look out the window, her voice quieter this time. "Because sometimes, fate brings us exactly where we're supposed to be, even if it's not where we want to go." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. The road stretched on endlessly, ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the oppressive fog. The only sounds were the muted hum of the engine and my shallow, uneven breaths. I glanced at the woman again, hoping for some reassurance, but her presence only deepened my dread. Her posture was unnaturally rigid now, her hand still resting in her lap, fingers twitching slightly. Her face was partially turned away, but I could see the corner of her mouth twisting into an unnatural smile. "So," I began, trying to steady my voice, "what kind of music do you like?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head to face me, and for the first time, I noticed her eyes. They weren't just dark, they were voids, swallowing the faint light of the dashboard. My breath hitched as I forced myself to look away, pretending I hadn't seen. "You've been kind to me," she said, her voice a hollow whisper that seemed to echo in the confined space. "Yeah, well," I stammered, "it's what anyone would do." "Not everyone," she replied, her voice dropping an octave. The air grew colder, and the metallic scent became overwhelming. I opened the window a crack, hoping for relief, but the outside air was just as frigid and foul. I started to regret stopping at all. Then, without warning, she leaned closer. I could feel her cold breath on my neck. "Do you know why I was waiting?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. "To find someone who wouldn't look away," she whispered, her voice piercing my skull like an icy blade. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles aching. "Look, I don't know what you mean, but I think I should drop you off." "You can't," she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. I turned to protest but froze. Her face had changed. Her once delicate features were grotesquely distorted. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over jagged bones. Her mouth twisted into a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, and her eyes were bottomless pits of darkness. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The force jolted us both forward, and my heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the door handle. But when I looked back at the passenger seat, it was empty. The car was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I stumbled out onto the deserted road, clutching my chest as I scanned the fog for any sign of her. That's when I heard it, a chilling laugh, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the darkness ahead. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I jumped back into the car, started the engine, and floored it, the tires squealing as I sped down the endless road. The metallic scent lingered, clinging to the inside of the car like a curse. And though I was alone now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The car roared down the desolate road, its headlights barely piercing the oppressive fog. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, the cold sweat dripping down my forehead, stinging my eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, not to stop until I reached the safety of home, or anywhere else far from this nightmare. But the road seemed endless, an infinite stretch that mocked my desperation. The metallic stench was still there, clinging to the air like a ghostly reminder. My rearview mirror caught my eye, and though I didn't want to look, some unseen force compelled me to. For a moment, I thought I saw her again, sitting in the back seat, her distorted face grinning at me. But when I whipped my head around, the seat was empty. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I tried to focus, repeating to myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. "Keep driving. Don't stop. It's over," I muttered under my breath, as though saying it aloud could make it true. The radio crackled to life, startling me so badly that I nearly veered off the road. Static hissed from the speakers, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. I reached to turn it off, but just as my fingers brushed the dial, a voice emerged from the noise. "You can't escape," it said, a chilling whisper that felt like it came from inside my own head. My heart slammed against my ribs as I yanked the radio's knob, silencing the sound. But the damage was done. The words lingered, etched into my mind like a brand. The fog outside grew thicker, swallowing the road ahead. My headlights reflected strange shapes in the mist, twisting, writhing forms that seemed to reach out for the car. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, the engine whining in protest as the car sped forward. And then, just as abruptly as it began, the fog cleared. The road was suddenly visible again, illuminated under a sky full of stars. Relief flooded through me, my breaths coming in shaky gasps as I dared to believe I was free. But as I rounded a bend, my headlights revealed a sight that froze my blood. There she was, standing in the middle of the road, her grotesque face twisted into an expression of pure malice. Her skeletal frame was illuminated starkly, the hollow sockets where her eyes should have been boring into me. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt mere feet from her. My hands flew to the gear shift, ready to reverse, but the car refused to move. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me trapped in the suffocating silence. She began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, her bony fingers reaching out. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my gaze away despite every instinct screaming at me to look down, look anywhere but at her. The last thing I remember was her face, those dark, endless voids where her eyes should have been. They pulled me in, swallowing me whole, until there was nothing but darkness. When I woke up, I was in my driveway, slumped over the wheel of my still silent car. The night was eerily quiet, the air free of that metallic stench. But something was different, the lingering chill in my bones, the faint whisper I thought I heard as I stumbled toward my front door. It all told me one thing: I hadn't escaped. Not really. She was still with me,